Hello. Welcome back to Hours of Harvard. It is April, and we're going to look at 7 more books this month. It's going to be a very fast and rushed episode because it is late in the afternoon, and daylight savings has happened already in Sydney, where I'm making this video, which means that the sun is going to set as we speak, and it's going to get very dark and probably look very bad. So, I'm going to quickly just get right into the books. Okay. Whoa, okay, so this is really hard to balance. Not because I read a lot, but because there is one particular book this month that is just very, very big. So we will get to that. But I did manage to get one from every category this month, which really surprised me because some of these took way longer than I thought they were going to. But oh well, let's get into it. Alright, so first thing I read this month is Pizza Girl by Kyoung Frazier. And this is interesting. It's realism. It's about this, I want to say, like, middle American teenage or 18-year-old pizza delivery driver who's pregnant and who has a loving mother and a loving partner, but can't quite explain why that things don't feel quite right in her life. And it's this coming-of-age story where she's working as a pizza delivery driver, and one day she gets this phone call from a middle-aged housewife and mother who has trouble raising her family, and they end up having this connection between the generations, and this protagonist ends up finding a lot about herself and about how she sees the world. It was okay. I've been told that in the wake of Convenience Store Woman, books like this have become very popular. I haven't read Convenience Store Woman, so I can't really comment on that. This is one of the first books of this style that I've read, where it's just very ordinary, very quotidian, someone going about their day-to-day life, looking at their struggles and their emotional truths, and it's very honest, I will say. I feel like the emotions that are trying to be expressed by the author in this book, they come across very clearly. There's that clear longing for meaning and a wistful sadness, but also just a desire to be rebellious and funny, and there's a lot of energy that comes across that. I think it's written quite well. The first-person protagonist is engaging enough. She's 18, so I guess you have to forgive her for all the ways that a normal 18-year-old would see the world. It can probably come off as very frustrating, but I did sympathize with her a great deal. Just one thing that got raised for me is that the protagonist of this book is pregnant, and she does consume alcohol quite often throughout this, and it's represented as her kind of struggling with her role as a mother and not really being sure of how to cope with the various stresses upon her life. And I don't know why, but that very viscerally made me uncomfortable. And I kind of had to interrogate that thought within myself, because as someone who I realize will never be pregnant, will never understand or empathize with that experience to the fullest extent, I don't know why that made me feel so strongly. I actually read a book last year called Indelible Ink, and that had also depictions of pregnant people consuming alcohol, and it again made me very uncomfortable, and I wonder why that's the case. Anyways, I think that it is quite clearly elucidated here. At no point did I particularly hate the protagonist, even when I didn't agree with her actions. I thought they were very understandable, and I did get a lot of meaning out of this book, even as I think it's quite disposable, which is why I have put it in the trash category. It's good. I would suggest reading it if you can find a copy of it. It seems like the thing that won't be hard to find copies of just around used bookstores, libraries. I'm sure you'll get a copy of this somewhere, and it's fine. I think I gave this a 3 out of 5. It's okay. There's nothing overtly bad I can say about this. The only thing that I will mention, though, is that I find that the blurb and the first lines and everything makes this big deal of the strange order that the woman gets. So the first line is her name was Jenny Hauser, and every Wednesday I put pickles on her pizza, and it's a recurring motif of a pizza with pickles on it. It doesn't actually matter to the narrative at all, the fact that this pizza is weird. It could have been a pineapple pizza. It doesn't really matter. It's just something that seems quirky to get the reader in. But ultimately it's a story just about a young girl trying to find her place in life, having trouble with coming to terms with a pregnancy, and realizing that the people in her life that are meant to be there to take care of her are exactly that, and aren't, secretly out to get her or judge her or something. It's the recognition that people are fallible, but that ultimately everyone is looking out for you and looking out for your best interests. So I quite liked it. Okay, book 2 with this terrifying cover is Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson. And this is interesting because it's kind of autofiction, kind of not. It's a fictionalized account of a journalist's drive to Las Vegas to cover this racing event. I almost want to say drag racing, but I don't know. I don't know anything about racing. And the protagonist and their compadre, friend is attorney. I'm very vague on the terminology because they're not very friendly to each other. They're just in the same car together. It's the journalist and their attorney, and they just take a lot of drugs, like a significant amount of drugs, a worrying amount of drugs. So many different kinds of drugs. And as someone who is not very judgmental about people who take drugs, I was still worried that the fact they were mixing so many different substances, and it was just concerning the whole way through. And I'm guessing that's what this is meant to do. I'm guessing this is what the author is trying to explain, that in the wake of the 60s and the kind of free love movement and the experimentation with psychoactives and things like that, that it was dangerous and it was concerning. But yeah, I don't know. It's pretty bleak. I think it's interesting how the style of this novel is just so fast-paced and just frenetic, and it's just always influenced by some substance somewhere. And it's complemented by these interesting illustrations, which I believe were there in the original edition, and these illustrations are often quite terrifying. I want to find one I can show him the thing without like getting the video taken down. Yeah, it's all like animalistic and black and white, and everything's like tentacles and bleeding and multiple eyes. It's just horrific, absolutely horrific. The narrative... Wow, look, if I was to actually tell you about what happens in this book, I can't remember it, because it's about a month since I've read it, and just so much happens, and so many drugs are involved, that I genuinely can't give you a straight answer of what happens. I do remember it being straightforward. I think the protagonist, the journalist, goes to cover these races. Some stuff happens, there's some talking, some sly deals, there's very ambiguous relationships between the protagonist and some of the characters, and it's just a ride. I think it's a good experience if you're interested in this kind of era of America, or just interested in a lot of drugs. Then this does represent that. It does do that. I gave it a 3 out of 5. Alright, next on the list is one that I've been meaning to get to for a while. This one's been on my shelf for nearly 10 years, I would say. This is Northern Lights by Philip Pullman. Classic young adult trilogy. It's the Northern Lights, and then it's the Amber Spyglass, and then it's Northern Lights, then the Subtle Knife, then the Amber Spyglass, and they form this trilogy of a fantasy series about multiverses and multiple worlds. And this first one starts in a world where, kind of like ours, there's countries. The countries and the borders are kind of set up like ours. It's a little bit vaguely steampunky in that there's airships and zeppelins, and I can't remember if they're guns. I think there are guns. I can't quite remember. But there's no like high-tech electricity kind of stuff, right? It's all very still experimental. It's that era where universities are trying to figure out how to harness basic laws of nature, like atomic power, electric power, those kinds of experimentations, leading to a very dark environment where there's this grey morality about what is right and what is meant to be done. In the midst of all of this, and I even entirely forgot that in this universe, every person just has their own little pet demon familiar. And they're just, I'm assuming they're born with it, they're just this animal that floats around, and when you're a kid, that animal can change shapes, and when you're an adult, that animal tends to solidify into its shape. So depending on what kind of childhood you have, your demon will reflect what kind of person you end up becoming. For example, one example they've given is, if you're a sailor, if you live around in the ocean, then you tend to have an aquatic familiar. Some people are very lucky to get seagulls or albatrosses. Other people are very unlucky to get aquatic things like fish, and that means they can't leave living near the ocean. But it's explained that every individual's connection to their familiar is just so intimately close that to be without your familiar is seen as like grotesque or unusual. And that's just what the society is like, is that everybody has this little demon that can help them out with things. They can talk, they have a close relationship with them, and we follow a young girl named Lyra who's growing up in the Oxford University, and she's privy to a lot of those government secrets about power sources and research and wars and frontiers and all that fun stuff. And then she ends up going on this big quest to the north to save the people she cares about. And when I started reading this, I thought that I wasn't really a fan of fantasy, because I don't like being introduced to worlds that are extremely different to mine. Like, if the author comes and tells me, hey, there's this world and everyone's got a pet demon that they can talk to and that helps them through their lives, and be like, cool, how does that affect me, right? Like, this is not the world that I live in. This is some made-up world you're trying to get me to be on board with, and I am not on board with that. However, after all that stuff gets said and done, about 100 pages in, then the plot really kicks in. And I found this was plotted very, very well. Once the audience is on board with the rules of this world, it goes so fast and it's so interesting, and there's so many interesting character interactions, there's so many great places they go to. I had a lot of fun. One other dynamic to be aware of is that this series is often called kind of like an atheist response to C.S. Lewis's The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and to a lesser extent to J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings series. Both of those really famous fantasy series are laden with Christian iconography, Christian values and morals, and this one takes a very different angle. It's much more critical of religion. It kind of appropriates elements from Christian theology in this book, and I've been told that in the second and third ones it gets even more polemical about that. So just be aware that that's the thematics we're dealing with, and it's also pretty gruesome for what I was told initially is a middle grade book. So I actually don't know what that means. In America, middle grade, I'm guessing, is prep school, right? So it's like 12, 13, 14 years old. It's pretty dark. It's pretty dark. I think like mid-teenagers would go for this. I still enjoyed it quite greatly as an adult. I would give it a 4 out of 5. I think it's on the light side as fantasy goes, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I think it's just a nicely told quest narrative. Starts and ends, and it's just pretty satisfying. Alright, next one. So this is my world literature of the month. This is Chronicle of a Last Summer by Yasmine El-Rashidi, and it's subtitled A Novel of Egypt, so no guesses for where this is set. This is a novel about the political upheaval within Egypt in the latter 20th century, early 21st century, which is something that I knew basically nothing about. So the only thing I knew about Egypt going into this book was studying Anwar Sadat's speech in year 12, and I've mostly forgotten that. And so this book is exploring what it felt like to grow up in Egypt as a young woman from 3 time periods. So during, I'm just going to quickly go back and search it, summer of 1984, and then summer of, I think 1992 was the next one, 1998, and then summer of 2014, I believe. So it's actually quite a recently published book. I feel like if I knew more of the history, I would be much clearer on what this book is trying to do, because it's definitely trying to illustrate how life is different under each of these rulers and under each of these regimes. It tries to explore individual freedoms and attitudes and how it felt to exist within that moment, how it felt to talk with your loved ones who might feel this way or that about the person currently in power. And it's, even as someone who doesn't know a lot about the history of Egypt, I found it very interesting, because I think I relate to it a little bit from my experience growing up in China and knowing the changes between each Chinese president, is that there is absolutely a slightly different attitude or vibe that comes with each new person in power, and being able to adapt to that is just something unique to my identity, or more correctly my parents' identity, as people who lived through China in the latter 21st century. And I'm guessing that the novelist is trying to illustrate a very similar thing here. I really did like the first person voice. I thought it was so easy to read, so clear and crisp, and the voice is just very endearing as well. She is a film director, and she is struggling with the question of what is the purpose of making film when you are from this kind of environment, right? Because the study of film and film art is so rare in Egypt, according to the narrator, that it becomes a big question of what is she trying to do this for? Why would you not do something more immediately beneficial to whoever you support? And ultimately, what are you going to make films of? What are you going to make films for? That was quite interesting. And I can imagine that kind of concern works its way into the meta of the novel as well. Like, why write this novel? Especially because this novel, more so than a lot of the others I've read in this category, feel like it's aimed towards a Western audience, more specifically American audience. I think they're trying very hard to make Egypt feel foreign, to feel like a different country, so that someone from a Western audience would read it and go, oh, that's so different to my life outside, which is not what I wanted to get out of reading books from other countries. I think, not that it's not valuable to have books like this, but I feel like I would benefit more from reading books that have been written for the country that they were written within. And I'm not sure if this is what I found here. I found this in a used bookstore and I knew really nothing about it, but sometimes these are the best experiences, right? When you pull a book off a shelf and you don't know anything about it and you can approach it with no assumptions or no prejudices. And for what it's worth, I did really like the prose. I did really like the protagonist. I felt like I could have understood the central conflict more, and maybe if I had more time I would have done my research as I was reading. Maybe I would have gotten a lot more out of it. But as it is, I would have given this a 3 out of 5. If you're interested in the historical era, or if you're personally connected to it, there is probably a lot of interesting stuff here. I can't say anything definitively, very unfortunately, and it's such a shame because last month I could talk more authoritatively on Do Not Say We Have Nothing, because I am much more familiar with Chinese culture and Chinese language and everything that happened there, and just put me here and I feel like, ooh, I don't know enough. I need to know more. And I would like to know more. I would hope that reading like this is an exercise in slowly beginning to know more. Alright, book 4, it's upside down. Book 5! This is the big book for April. This is Emma by Jane Austen. Word count of about 660,000, I think, last time I checked. It is Jane Austen's longest novel. It is about Emma Woodhouse, who is 19, I want to say, or 20 years old, and she doesn't see herself as wanting to ever be in a relationship or ever be in a marriage, but she insists on tampering with the lives of those around her to matchmake. And I found this a very hard read. So I know that this is prescribed on the Year 12 syllabus, and I had to read it so that I could know what I'm talking about when I'm teaching students this term. It's very, very slow. It's incredibly slow. And I think I probably should have known that going into it, because this is just what Jane Austen is, right? It's Regency realism, it's people going to each other's houses for dinner parties and talking about the weather and being offended if someone waits for 5 seconds before they give you an answer. That's just kind of what we're in for. So I really should have been more prepared for what I ended up getting. In this book, very little happens, but of the things that do happen, everything is explained through primarily the eyes of Emma Woodhouse, our 20-ish-year-old protagonist, and she, at least in the beginning, is a little bit insufferable. Like, she thinks that she knows 100% of what everybody around her is thinking, but Austen also makes it very clear to us that she just, of course she doesn't, right? No one can, but the audacity of her to think that she does, and then slightly and very slyly influence the people around her to try and conform with her narrative and her worldview, was very frustrating to me. And there were some early scenes which maybe I didn't necessarily disagree with, but really made me question my assumptions of why I felt so strongly about what Emma was doing and why I personally didn't like it so much. And there's a lot of issues with class and gender, which I think everyone who reads Jane Austen has to kind of reckon with in modern society, which is that Austen doesn't love class divides, but she also doesn't really advocate for the the destruction of them. And she's writing in a historical period where class divides are just so much more pronounced than they are today, where how much money your family has or how much property your family owns kind of also dictates how good of a person you are. And this assumption really comes ahead in many of the relationships and the character interactions of this novel, to a point where it gets a bit frustrating. And I think if you're someone who can look past that, then there are a lot of really interesting moments in this novel. I don't know how much people know about it, so I'm just kind of refraining from spoiling too much about it, but it does illustrate the coming of age of Emma and her discovering and really kind of testing the limits of whether her values are correct or not. She will often take action and then speak to her older friend, Mr. Knightley, who gives her guidance, and I'll very often just roast her and explains to her, like, oh, Emma, everything you did just then was terrible. And Emma goes, yes, I agree. It's interesting because so rarely in life do we have the opportunity to just test our limits and act the way that we think we want to act, and then reflect back on it and think about what the consequences were. I think so often we are thinking about what others might think, that we may be a little bit reluctant to view the world on our own terms. And Emma is a character who is absolutely unafraid to view the world on her own terms. She does things as she pleases. She has her own view of the world that she thinks is correct, and she will enforce that. And there is a kind of beauty in watching that play out, in seeing how everyone else reacts to her, in watching her have genuine consequences and feedback and growth from that type of behavior. I think it's very reminiscent of how, I guess, we all conducted ourselves when we were younger, when we were teenagers, but to experience that, I think, is quite a valuable thing. And that wasn't what I was going to say when I first started talking about this book. I was mostly going to talk about how slow and pedantic it is. Like, there's one moment where a character gets a haircut, and all the other characters are like, oh no, how dare they get that haircut? How dare they spend an entire day to go to London and get their hair cut? Oh, that's horrible. And you know, as a modern responder, just like, come on, get over yourself. But ultimately, if you're willing to meet the book on its own terms and kind of recognize that to read Austen, you have to set aside a bunch of annoying assumptions about class, it's interesting. It is very interesting. Towards the end, there are also lots of great emotional moments. I don't think it's so much what happens as it is spending enough time with this book that you start to see the world through Austen's eyes and start to see a little bit of the world through Emma's eyes as well, and to be in that kind of middle ground between sympathizing with her and judging her, knowing that while not everything she does is correct, the intentions behind what she's doing are crystal clear and she is just going to act on her best instincts. I think that's quite interesting. So ultimately I would still give it a 3 out of 5. I think my experience of reading this novel was not great. I know people that love this novel and will just dote on it every day and talk about every chapter and every word and every character, and I don't have that relationship with this. I liked Pride and Prejudice quite a bit more, and I haven't read any other Austen, so I'll have to go through and look at the other ones, but although I can see what this is going for, although I can see why other people might really, really like this, it just didn't do it for me, unfortunately. It just didn't do it for me. Alright, book 6, this is my Australian book of the year. This is Anita Heiss, her latest book, Bila, Yarrudhanggalangdhuray. I'm going to have a hard time pronouncing that, so that's the first and last time I'm going to say it. And that translates in the Wiradjuri language to River of Dreams. And this is a novel set in the 1850s around the Gundagai and Wagga Wagga regions, lands of the Wiradjuri people of New South Wales, or Australia, Indigenous Australians. So what happens in this novel is there's this great flood of Gundagai that's actually recorded in historical tradition, where white settlers built their houses along the riverbanks of the... oh, I've forgotten the river. The Murrumbidgee, I think, is what the river is called. No, I can't... no. How did I forget that? What is it? Yes, so the book is really concerned with the Murrumbidgee River, and it starts with this scene of white settlers building their houses so close to the riverbank, and the local indigenous population looking at them and going, you shouldn't build there. That's a bad idea. We know this river is going to flood, which is why we really don't suggest building there. And of course the white settlers are like, we know rivers, we've seen them, we can build wherever we want, thank you very much. And of course, in the first few chapters, a devastating flood happens, and that affects all the people of this society, including a young Aboriginal woman who is living within a white household that just happened to be built right on the riverfront. And so the book starts with a lot of trauma. There is a European family and a young Aboriginal woman, and they just lose so much. But it also integrates the very true historical story of Yarra and Jackie, who went around this environment and saved people in their canoes, even as was kind of brought on by the settlers, right? The settlers built in places that Aboriginal people told them not to, because they knew how dangerous it was going to be, how clearly it was going to flood, and then the white colonists said, nah, don't worry about it, and they had to be saved. And despite this, we still see in this book all the injustices that Aboriginal Australians faced in this time. They worked for rations and for board, they didn't earn money of their own, and they were often prejudiced against by all the people in society. What's really interesting is that there is a white character that's represented quite sympathetically, and that is this young Quaker woman. So sorry, all the names have just escaped me right away. But she, from her religion, has ingrained respect for all human beings of all cultures, including Aboriginal Australians, although, as a Quaker, she's a minority across the Christians that have arrived in Australia. And so she has a hard time convincing other European settlers that it is worthwhile to treat Aboriginal Australians as friends and as equals. Meanwhile, there is the main European man of this story, James Bradley. Gosh, I really should talk the names. So the protagonist, the Aboriginal woman, is named Wagadine, and she ends up in the household of the Bradleys. So James and David Bradley, who are the two survivors of the flood, they moved to Wagga Wagga, and the story is really exploring their family life there. And I think this book gives me a lot of what I wanted from Benevolence, which is that it's a lot slowed down. It lets these characters kind of sit there and enjoy the environments. There's some very beautiful scenes that just show the kind of natural beauty of the area, and also the expertise of people who lived there, how they knew what all the native plants would do, the native animals, and also just how the environment itself had been structured over time, and so they can live most prosperously from it. I thought that also this book was quite hopeful in that it represents attitudes towards life that are very positive. It doesn't bask quite as much in just trauma after trauma. Instead, it shows characters recovering, leaning on each other, and how breaking the boundaries between European assumptions towards Aboriginal Australians ultimately leads to a greater outcome in the end. I thought that there are very heartening moments in here, even though it doesn't shy away from representing the kind of discrimination that I think is just historically true, right? Yeah, it makes a very painful part of history feel a little bit more hopeful and a little bit more uplifting, and I think that's kind of what we need in 2020. And I hate to make this criticism, but on a sentence level I did trip up every now and then. I found that the big flaw in some of the sentence writing here is that there's dialogue, and then there's a description of what the dialogue is supposed to do. A character will say something, and then the narration will then describe what was being said again. And over time, I felt that distracted and grazed it a little bit. However, I thought overall the plotting, so just the stuff that happens and the sequence in which happens, is just really immaculate. I really like the emotional complexity that is experienced by these characters. That Wagadine finds companionship with Europeans in the same way that, well, not the same way, but in a surprisingly gentle and positive way, and that creates conflict with what she's known of her people. And then, having moved from Gundagai to Wagga Wagga, the novel really explains how difficult that is, to be taken from somewhere that you knew very intimately with family and people who really cared about you, and to be taken from there and moved to another location it breaks down the kind of assumptions that we might have about what it means to be Aboriginal, is that it's not a homogenized nation, but it isn't. It is also not a fractured nation. I think there's just a lot here to explain ties to the land and ties to community in a very positive way. There's also a lot of Aboriginal language used here. I didn't find it ever made it quite difficult for me to understand. In fact, I wanted it to be more difficult. I wanted this book to kind of force me to learn the language more, and it didn't really do that. It kind of just used simple nouns and verbs in a way that it's understandable through context. But I think the effort of doing that is still very valuable. I think even just having a title like this, to challenge readers with naming a book like this, I think it's all very worthwhile. It's all an exercise in preservation and remembering that these elements of history are useful and important and worth keeping. So, yeah, I gave this a 4 out of 5. Okay, and last one for April. This one's a quick one. Henry James, The Turn of the Screw. Infamously studied in high school. Very, very short ghost story novella. And the story of this is so incredibly simple. There is this young woman who is tasked to take care of these 2 children in this big and possibly haunted house named Bly Manor. The children are supposed to be raised by their uncle, but the uncle has disappeared, and the uncle's basically told the governess, I do not want to hear anything about this house. So you doing your job properly should just be you taking care of these kids, making sure they get an education, and I don't want to be told anything at all. And he just disappears into the night. And so this protagonist has the trouble of, first of all, seeing these children and realizing that they're just great. They're really well behaved. They have fantastic values. However, the young boy gives her a letter and says, hey, by the way, I was expelled from my school. Do with that what you will, right? And over the course of a few months living in this manor, the protagonist starts seeing these 2 ghostly figures who aren't that threatening at all, really. They're just people that may be people that died there previously, and just kind of stand around in unexpected places, but the protagonist starts to believe that there's something sinister going underneath the surface. Between these 2 kids and these 2 ghosts seem to appear all the time, and so the novel is about the quest that she has to unravel a grand mystery if there is one. And what I love about this book, and I can see the DNA of this book in horror stories that I love from after, especially The Haunting Hill House, is that this book has ambiguities in it, specifically to confuse and mislead and gaslight the reader. So you leave this book with a feeling of, I don't feel like I got the whole picture. In fact, I think there could possibly be some darker, sinister significance to very innocuous moments in this book, but I don't know that for sure. I haven't been spelt out exactly what makes the events of this story horrific, so I now get to brood and think and theorize what this novel is really trying to say. I also know from the context that Henry James was quite influenced by the burgeoning area of psychology, things like the subconscious and of dreams and haunting, and all of that is just very nicely, complexly laced into here, but it is also, at its heart, an incredibly simple ghost story. The only thing that kind of holds me back from giving it stronger praise is that it's written... It wasn't even written that long ago. It was written in the 1890s, right? But the language, I think possibly to communicate a kind of gothic atmosphere, is long and convoluted. The sentences are so long, and sometimes it's hard to figure out exactly what's happening. Very often, I'd read a couple of pages and go, I don't know what happened there, so I have to go back and flip back and read them again. It is graceful that the chapters are very short, but it does take a bit more effort than your average modern novel, I would say. I read it in the lens of social class. I feel like it's a theme of this month, actually. I read it in the lens of social class because the protagonist, the young governess, is not from the same level of wealth that the uncle and the 2 kids are, and so she effectively is trying to infiltrate this area and understand their values and kind of meet them on their own terms. And that's where she gets a lot of her anxiety and paranoia from, and I think that, for me, is the explanation of the ghosts. But I've seen many different and many more interesting and valid interpretations, and I can't say for a fact that any of them are more correct than the other. So if you're a person that likes theorizing, if you like thinking about stories and expounding on their greater significances, and you're okay with a book that has quite significant gaps, then this is really fun. Turn of the Screw was a really good read. I would still give it a 4 out of 5. I think that if you were to get it, don't get this cover. Oh, it's the worst cover. I dislike this cover so much. It doesn't fit the story at all. It bothers me so much. Okay, and that's my 7 books for April. I got through every category, and very thankful that I'm able to keep up with all of this. Next month, I've already gotten some of the way into my first book of May. It's going to be really business as usual. I think what will happen is, in the second half of the year, I do want to start tackling some harder things. I wouldn't say that anything I've read this year has been particularly challenging or difficult. I have been working through some classics as I've been doing some modern books as well, but I do feel like I am missing something big, something chunky. I haven't quite gotten there yet. And I think that's a product that will take me over the course of multiple months rather than fitting into something like this. So I will think about that, and I will get back to you next month. But thank you for joining, and I will see you in... June. I will see you in June. June. I'll see you in June.